Welcome, everyone, and good morning. My name is Dave Broyles. I'm Director of CNA's Special Activities and Intelligence Program. On behalf of our President and CEO, Catherine McGrady, I'd like to welcome you for what I'm sure will be an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. Before we begin, I have a few administrative notes. Today's topic is on the use of digital surveillance technologies during COVID and the potential futures for these tools in both democratic and authoritarian states. For today's format, we have two speakers joining us, and each of them will provide framing remarks for about 10 minutes. We'll follow that with a moderated discussion, and then we'll turn to the audience for questions and comments. If you are participating through Zoom, you can send a question through the Q&A feature. The chat box will also be open, but we request that you don't submit questions there in order to keep the process more streamlined. If you're calling in, you can send a question to cna_nss@cna.org. That's the same email address that sent you dial-in information yesterday. Please note that today's event is unclassified and has been advertised publicly. We are recording the event and may post it on our site or social media accounts following the event. If this is your first encounter with CNA, we are a nonprofit research organization comprised of the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analyses is the federally funded research and development center for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, but we also work across the Department of Defense and other U.S. government agencies. And our Institute for Public Research supports Homeland Security, public safety, and emergency operations at all levels of government. Today's seminar series is part of the National Security Seminar Series. CNA created this series to bring together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academic and research institutions, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations to share their expertise, facilitate discussions, and contribute to an ongoing dialogue about issues affecting U.S. national security. The goal of the series is to raise critical questions facing U.S. national security, illuminate them from different perspectives, and create an environment where these topics can be discussed at a professional level without the normal constraints that we face in our day jobs. The theme of this year's series is National Security in a Post-Pandemic World. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted almost every aspect of life in 2020, forcing us to reshape our relationships, rethink the ways we work and travel, find new ways to connect and communicate, and redefined our sense of safety. The pandemic has had similar implications for national security, affecting U.S. security partnerships, operations and logistics, and the health and safety of government and military personnel. These effects will likely continue to resonate for years to come. In 2021, CNA's National Security Seminar Series is considering the ways in which the pandemic has reshaped the contours of the national security landscape and is exploring challenges the U.S. will face in a changed world. Today's discussion will focus on the use of digital surveillance technologies during COVID and the potential futures for these tools in both democratic and authoritarian states. After COVID began its spread around the world, democratic and authoritarian states alike made use of surveillance technologies in their efforts to contain the virus's spread and to safeguard their citizens' health. Even after COVID diminishes as a problem, the more widespread use of surveillance technologies could have ramifications that will shape political systems and global dynamics in the future. What changes will we see as countries become more accustomed to the use of these technologies? Who will set the norms? How can democracies employ digital surveillance in a legal, ethical, and transparent manner? Today's NSS event will explore these questions and more as we compare the approaches of democratic and authoritarian states in their use of surveillance technologies and assess the implications going forward. I'm joined today by two outstanding and accomplished individuals who will each provide background and nuance to part of our discussion. Dr. Sheena Greitens will speak on the use of digital surveillance technologies in authoritarian states. Dr. Greitens is an associate professor at the University of Texas's LBJ School of Public Affairs, whose work focuses on topics including East Asia, American national security, and authoritarian politics and foreign policy. Dr. Greitens is currently working on two main research projects, one on China's internal security policies and their implications for China in the world, and another on authoritarian diasporas, particularly focused on North Korea. Dr. Elizabeth Wishnick will speak on the use of digital surveillance tools in democracies. Dr. Wishnick is a senior research scientist in CNA's China and Indo-Pacific Affairs Division, where her recent research has included, among other topics, the role of digital power in Taiwan's strategy to combat COVID-19. She is also a professor of political science at Montclair State University, a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asia Institute, and currently completing a Fulbright Global Award in China, Russia, and Kazakhstan. So before I turn to our speakers, I have to say that I'm really excited for today's conversation. I brewed up a nice pot of tea, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. For the last 3.5 years, I've had the honor of co-hosting AI with AI, a weekly podcast where we discuss the latest breakthroughs and implications in AI and autonomy. Perhaps not surprisingly, over the last year, we've covered many stories that involve AI technologies and the COVID pandemic. These stories have included the AI technology itself, such as video surveillance tools that measure the separation distances of people or that verify mask compliance. We've covered a variety of technologies that use machine learning to help increase detection of the virus, whether through analysis of an individual's cough, X-ray images, blood samples, or other means, as well as the creation of tracing applications and the efforts to anonymize data. These AI and COVID stories have also included policy issues and discussions as democratic nations grapple with how to make use of these technologies in ways that protect the privacy of its citizens. That issue of data privacy in particular continues to be a challenge in the United States. Machine learning algorithms require large volumes of data, and the average US citizen has increasingly fewer ways to control their data and how it's being used. These machine learning capabilities also enable more widespread and more powerful surveillance technologies. While surveillance itself is nothing new, the confluence of the COVID-19 pandemic and those data-hungry machine learning technologies have provided some interesting insight into how nations and societies are handling the issue of surveillance. So with that, we turn to our guests to hear more. Dr. Greitens, let's begin with your discussion on the use of digital surveillance technologies in authoritarian states. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion today and look forward to conversation with a terrific group. So I appreciate the invitation, and I'm grateful to CNA and to you for organizing this event this morning. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how surveillance factors into China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I start with China for two reasons. First of all, it is the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. And second, because its construction of a really extensive surveillance state has garnered headlines both before the pandemic occurred and since that time. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about where surveillance fits in China's response and what that means for these trends in global digital surveillance. I will add that as a democratic citizen, I'm really interested in all the questions that Dave just raised. But for the moment, I'm going to bracket those in the United States and talk more about the autocratic portion of our world today. So I think it's important to recognize that China's surveillance drive was not only underway, but very, very well developed prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. And so we need to think a little bit about which features of China's surveillance state have been augmented or amplified by the global health trends and developments that we've seen, and which of those are pre-existing and what their drivers are. And so I would start by just setting the stage and pointing out that many of us have or will have read stories about China's surveillance state in the years prior to last spring. That's because Xi Jinping has really invested. He's not the only or first Chinese leader to do so, but is heavily invested in the buildup of local surveillance capacity in China. and that's been part of a broader overhaul of his approach to what the party state calls national security. But it's important to remember that when we use this phrase national security, you talk about Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept, that when Chinese scholars and researchers write about this, they explicitly say things like the center of gravity of national security work is internal, and that the core or the foundation of national security is political security, which means the leadership of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party with Xi Jinping at the core. That's one of the common formulations or part of it. And so I think it's, that we need to see surveillance as a tool that fits within this larger approach that Xi Jinping has taken. And the goal, as it's often described in this discourse on national security and internal security, is a multidimensional information-based system of prevention and control for social security and social stability. And so I think that tells you pretty quickly what the role of information is, what the goals are. That phrase is a mouthful. I think in both Chinese and English, there's no clear, clean, better way to translate it that I've found. But also that this aim of prevention and control is really central. And that matters for the pandemic because prevention and control is a phrase that appears in the late 1990s and early 2000s in China's public security discourse, but it also appears in conversations about public health. There's a version of it that's in the name of China's CDC, the full name of China's CDC. And so one of the things that we see is that in China's model of pandemic response, surveillance and the sort of broader architecture of public security and social control was critical to the way that China chose to respond to the pandemic. And so the pandemic augmented and accelerated some of these trends that were already underway. One of the things that I think the pandemic has affected is a problem that the Chinese party state has been trying to solve in its use of data and surveillance data for some time. And that's something that Li Keqiang has called information islands. The idea that when China, launched this informatization drive, launched this push for digital governance, that a lot of different government bureaucracies and local actors, procured surveillance technologies, started gathering data via digital and other means, digitizing existing data, but that you ended up with a bunch of different systems or tools that were all collecting data that didn't talk to each other. And so the awareness, that push to get rid of information islands, to integrate data and make it actually more useful for governance, is something that China has been working on in the 2016 to 2020 period. And the pandemic, I think, accelerated a couple of things. One was this process or this push toward data integration, which was, again, already underway. But the pandemic provided a real sort of sense of urgency for that task, and also a way for the party state to say, like, this is a legitimate goal. We've got to get this done for public health and safety. And so it enabled a different kind of presentation of some of these projects to the Chinese citizenry. Let me also say that I think it's important to note a couple other things about this model. First of all, since you mentioned AI, the use of predictive analytics and AI tools is still pretty early in China's surveillance state. We tend to focus on the cases where it comes up or where there's a really interesting, potentially scary story about the use of these tools. But I think it's important to remember that this is an area that, especially when you look at China's own perception of how surveillance systems work, that the feedback that we've heard and that I've gathered is that people perceive that this isn't working very well. And in fact, the ability to collect this data has outstripped first the capacity to integrate it, but then second, also the capacity to do anything with it. And so I think that's probably the next push that we'll see in the Chinese surveillance ecosystem, is really this focus. Xi Jinping has already started talking about the imperative to attract AI and recruit AI and talent and develop China's sort of human capacity in this realm. And so I think it's sometimes I worry a little bit that some of these journalistic takes are doing the marketing for some of these companies by overstating their omniscience. And so I think we need to think about what the right balance is between being concerned about the trajectory of these developments, but not overstating their capacity, because one of the goals is obviously to deter certain types of activity. And it's not clear that if we present these systems as more omniscient than they actually are, may actually be augmenting and adding to the effect that the party state is hoping to achieve. Let me turn to the implications for global digital surveillance quickly here. So one of the things that we've seen in terms of the export of China's surveillance technology is that it's occurred pretty widely globally. A paper I wrote for the Brookings Institution last year found that as of the end of 2019, at least 80 countries in the international system had adopted not just surveillance technology from China, but some kind of platform that actually tried to integrate this data. And again, we use that metric because it's the integration function that really makes a lot of these, fancy surveillance tools much more useful for actual governance and political activity. And so those countries were across the range of regime type. There were some democracies that had adopted them, there were autocracies, and then there were some mixed or hybrid regimes. And interestingly, the 2008 Olympics, the Beijing Olympics, seemed to really serve as a demonstration point that led to or catalyzed a global diffusion process. And what we see in the data is that, for example, once a country in a particular region adopts one of these platforms, other countries in the region become much more likely to do so. And the other predictor of adoption of these platforms is having a strategic partnership with China. If you look at the foreign ministries list, that's actually a pretty good predictor of where these technologies will end up. But again, this really spans regime type. This matters, I think, because then when you actually take a look at the effects of this technology, and this is some work I'm doing now that I hope to have out for review and public scrutiny soon, is that there actually is a negative effect on repression and human rights, and those are things that that's the thing that we worry about. And we find that there is good reason to worry about that, right? The introduction of these technologies is associated with an increase in repression. And so that should be deeply concerning. But the other interesting finding is that China and the Chinese companies that market this technology often talk about it as solving governance problems. And when you look at the places that have adopted these technologies, they're often subnational or provincial officials who say, well, I really have to get crime under control. We have a public safety problem, and I've got to get a handle on this so that, I can create jobs and attract investment and tourism and all the things that make that mayors and provincial governors and other officials might typically judge performance on, right? They're thinking less about the foreign policy dynamics and national security implications and much more about local economic and public safety imperatives. But the problem is that the initial data that we've collected show that there actually isn't a measurable effect on crime. So it turns out that the sort of biggest marketing point of a lot of these technologies, especially to democracies, doesn't hold up with a couple of years of data. And I think that's going to become increasingly important. And it's a really important thing then for democracies to talk about, because the upside appears pretty limited, and there is some evidence that the downside we worry about is there. And so, those are things that I think we need to really be careful about talking about, because it's different if this technology works and makes cities safer and does produce economic growth, but has these downsides of being politically repressive, than if there's really no upside and a real downside, right? That the trade-off becomes a little bit easier to talk about. Final point is just that, I think that what this does is place China is a major power in the international system. It is actively promoting its model of health surveillance and pandemic response. It's also really increased its law enforcement cooperation around the world in the last 5 or so years, through police training and police liaison activities and MOUs with any number of countries around the world. And so I think, historically, when a major power in the international system is autocratic, that does tend to create an environment that's more conducive to democratic backsliding into human rights violations. And so I think there's real reason for concern, and that the pandemic, again, really could be a mechanism through which that plays out this time, because we know that states of emergency and the declarations and measures that are passed under states of emergency often are much more difficult to roll back after an emergency subsides. So these things tend to be sticky. And we should worry a little bit that some of the health surveillance measures adopted during the pandemic are now going to be difficult to corral and make compatible with democracy and civil liberties. I don't want to tread too far on Dr. Wishnick's territory this morning, but I will just close by saying that we do have countries that have had experience with infectious disease outbreak that, before COVID ever happened, had thought and gone through a democratic process of figuring out how to use surveillance and put boundaries on it that made it more compatible with democracy. And I think the United States and allies and partners around the world should really be trying to learn from those experiences, and also thinking really carefully about what that means that we do in the next few years. Both to again, put boundaries on the technologies that have been deployed during the pandemic, and also then to make sure that we put in place measures going forward, like Taiwan and South Korea have done, so that we're not in a sort of state of emergency coping process if this happens again in the future. I think the wisdom of South Korea and Taiwan having done this post-SARS and post-MERS has shown in their not perfect, but relatively capable performance in handling COVID, from both a public health and a democracy standpoint. And so I'm excited to hear, what are the lessons we should be learning, because I think one of the biggest things that I take away from looking at these global trends is the need both to learn from and to amplify that experience. So I'll close there. Thank you so much, and over to you.
All right, that's a great segue into what Dr. Wishnick is going to talk about. Thank you very much, Dr. Greitens. As a reminder for everyone listening, we'll have question and answers available down the little banner at the bottom of the box, and Zoom is where you can put questions and answers. We'll do that after we hear from Dr. Wishnick and open up the discussion then. So looking forward to that discussion. In the meantime, over to you, Dr. Wishnick, to talk about the use of surveillance technologies in democratic states.
Thank you very much, Dave, and to CNA for organizing this very timely program. I'm going to share my screen with you to show you some slides. Normally, I'm someone who works on Chinese foreign policy and China-Russia relations, but during this COVID pandemic, I became very interested in the different regional responses to the pandemic. Partly this stems from my earlier experience living in Hong Kong during the SARS pandemic, when we had lots of time with universities closed to think about different regional responses. And so that led me to develop an interest in health security. And having also spent time in Taiwan, I was looking at the Taiwan case and found it really worth studying. And this is part of a co-authored article with a colleague based in Estonia, comparing Taiwan and Estonia in their use of digital tools to combat COVID-19. So I'm going to start where Sheena left off in terms of how authoritarian states use digital tools. And the conventional wisdom is that authoritarian states are better at dealing with pandemics because they can use all of these surveillance technologies that democracies would not be very amenable to. And the bigger assumption here is that geopolitics is very important, and that larger states will dominate cyberspace for their own goals. And so the Taiwan case shows a different a different perspective. And it also, it shows something about how Taiwan has addressed the pandemic. And also it asks new questions about Taiwan's vulnerability. So the use of digital tools, I argue, creates a kind of digital power that we should take into account when we look at Taiwan's role. And so to summarize the main points I'm going to talk about, I argue that regime type can't predict pandemic effectiveness. And when we think about our own country here in the United States, we had a lot of political division that impeded a successful response. But Taiwan is also a politically divided place, and this has not impeded the government and the society from effectively combating the pandemic. But digital power in Taiwan preceded the pandemic, just like Sheena described in the PRC. This was not created in the last year. This has had a long history in Taiwan, and it's based on certain factors. It's based on the production of digital technology, the government's use of big data, and also society's role in using these tools. And I'm going to explain these different partnerships that evolved in Taiwan and make some broader conclusions about how these digital tools have actually enhanced Taiwan's soft power, but also its sovereignty. Though, of course, many geopolitical challenges remain, and there's still some questions in Taiwan about the further use of digital tools beyond the pandemic. So just some figures here about democracies and COVID, and looking at comparing various democracies and their records. So Taiwan's record is stellar compared to many, only 10 deaths and not even 1,000 confirmed cases out of a population of 23 million. But there are different records in democracies. So it's impossible to conclude that democracies are terrible at managing pandemics because the governments lack the tools to mandate measures. That just is not borne out by the facts. Many democracies have had very successful strategies. And so Taiwan should be viewed within that context. But then to go back to the prehistory. So Taiwan has digital power as a producer of digital technology because of the strength of its semiconductor industry, which is globally important, the value of that industry for Taiwan's GDP, and the important place this puts Taiwan in terms of global technology trends. And for example, the US-China trade conflict and mutual efforts to reduce dependence on one another in terms of supply chains. And so the background to Taiwan's use of digital tools is its production of digital technology. So the goals of digital power in Taiwan also predated the COVID pandemic by a couple of decades. There was really a domestic imperative for creating them in terms of a couple of disasters that happened in 1999, a major power outage, a major earthquake, and then there was a major hacking event by China into Taiwan after a comment by former President Lee Teng-hui about Taiwan and China as two states. And so this led to an effort to create a digital tools to ensure the functioning of the government and to avoid disruptions. And so you had e-governance tools developed as a result of this, these challenges, and their purpose was not to create a surveillance state as is alleged in the Chinese case, but to increase government accountability, transparency, and also popular participation. And this had throughout the decades, this has led to more recent programs such as Digital Nation Smart Island to further promote digital innovation and domestically, and also Taiwan's image overseas as a digital innovator. And Taiwan ranks highly in terms of digital innovation globally. And so getting to the COVID case, Taiwan started out with some initial advantages, having experienced the SARS pandemic, still not a terrible record in terms of the cases and deaths, but a lot of issues in terms of achieving a smooth pandemic response, in terms of the working between the national and municipal authorities in Taipei, led to the creation of a command center back in 2004. And so this center was reactivated during the COVID pandemic and was able to supervise many of the digital tools. You had effective leaders with excellent background for dealing with a pandemic. You had the ability to produce PPE, although not initially in sufficient quantity, but certainly able to develop production. And you had the biomedical industries to develop testing and now vaccines. So Taiwan starts out in this good place when the pandemic hits. And so these are the digital tools were activated in two fronts. One was within the administrative state, within the government, and the second was within society. And so Taiwan also has a national health system, and this database was integrated with the customs database so that there was a record of health records were integrated with travel records. This is important because 2 million Taiwanese live in the PRC, and you had visitors also from more than 2 million visitors from the mainland visited Taiwan in 2019. So it was very important to make sure that the travel history and the health history were connected. Also, there was this case where you had a big cruise ship docking in Geelong in Taiwan, and these passengers, 3,000 of them, went off on a day trip. And so contact tracing was really crucial, and the government command center teamed up with a lot of private sector companies to trace more than 600,000 potential contacts. So big data was used there. And then a system was created in partnership with mobile carriers, an intelligence fence system to use GPS to track the location of quarantined people. So you had government teaming up with private sector and also involving the cooperation of citizens to provide this data to respond to the pandemic. In society, you had technology collectives stepping up. So these are people in society who work to make government more transparency. In particular, there's an initiative called GovZero that has been around in Taiwan since the Sunflower Revolution, and trying to help make information available. So this led to the crowdsourcing of mask availability in the first period of the pandemic when masks were in short supply, and eventually led the government to create a database to make mask availability and more easily accessible to the public. It also led to an effort to combat disinformation about the pandemic through creation of a bot that was put on the Line platform, which is like the Facebook of Taiwan. And so this is Agenda Jiada bot, which people could a contact to ask about information that they receive, whether it's true or not. And then you had also the role of NGOs in Taiwan to combat disinformation about the pandemic. So on the society side, the role of technology was to improve information access and confidence in information. However, there are limits to this. This is a democracy. So the use of these digital tools had to be based on a legal authority. And so there was legislation to authorize these kinds of tools for epidemic control. And polls show that overwhelmingly citizens of Taiwan gave authorities high marks for their pandemic response. However, it wasn't just a legal authority and the pandemic that contributed to public support. There's also fines involved, some very high fines that we would envy here, like $100,000 for spreading fake news, for example. You also had naming and shaming of quarantine violators, but also some compensation for people who had to stay home to take care of children, for example. But now the hot topic is whether Taiwan should have an EID, and that's proved more controversial because of concerns about the regulation of information and also the sourcing of certain components for this from other countries, including China. So this has not gone through yet. So temporary measures for COVID, people supported for the most part, but the further use remains controversial due to concerns over democratic consequences. And so this is my conclusion. Do these digital tools represent a vaccine of sorts against misinformation and inaccessibility of pandemic responses? So we see that these tools did provide certain key advantages for the government in terms of combating COVID. And the society played a role as well as the government in accepting these tools and collaborating with the public and private sectors in this response. And the way I see it, these tools contributed to social consensus. So even though democracies have many divisions that are allowed to flourish and contribute to their vibrancy, digital tools can, if used properly, can contribute to social consensus by providing transparency and accountability and information. And so I'd just like to conclude with what this means for our understanding of Taiwan's vulnerability. Geopolitically, Taiwan is seen as a very vulnerable place, but it has certain strengths because of its democracy and these tools from the digital power stores that it has from its production capability and its record of using digital tools for governance purposes to good effect within democratic framework. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I think you could also stop sharing your screen. All right, there we go. All right. Thank you both very much. Really some fascinating stuff, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So now's a great time for all of our participants to put questions that they would like to hear our panelists consider into the Q&A box. And while you're doing that, I'm going to throw out the first question, which is a little bit broader, but I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this. I've done a fair amount of research and work in the autonomy and AI area at the kind of strategy and policy level and whatnot. And I've noticed that it's often difficult to start conversations about the use of certain types of technologies, particularly when it comes to weapon systems, right? We work for the US Navy and the Marine Corps, and the Department of Defense. And so we're certainly concerned about how the military is going to be making use of these technologies. It's often difficult to start the conversation because everyone's minds immediately go to Terminator and the Hollywood portrayals of all the bad stuff, right? Whereas where we are in reality and the direction that we're aiming in it is quite different. And it can be really hard to break through those preconceptions and things. So I'm curious if there's been kind of a similar issue here in what both of you are seeing about the use of these technologies in your respective domains. Any thoughts on that? Sheena, we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a slightly different conversation when you're talking about military applications of these technologies than domestic applications, in part because the envisioned usage, the benefits and the risks are just are a little bit different. But I think in terms of how we talk about and frame public policy discussion about these technologies, one of the things that I've found is that you really need to start with just a description of what is and isn't occurring, and what the variation is, how these technologies might be used in certain ways in one place and in a different way or with a different effect in others. And so to me, I think one of the difficult things about the conversation is because people have read different news stories at different times and seen, a different piece of the discussion about applications. We often enter into these conversations with kind of different baselines about what is actually happening and therefore what we should be concerned about. And so part of why I think it's important to go through, what Dr. Wishnick just went through with how this process actually played out in Taiwan and some of the things that I talked about in China are that, I think we need to start by making sure everybody's got the same sense of what's occurring and what the stakes are, because if we've all seen different pieces, it's like the people in a room with the elephant, right? Your piece of the elephant might be very different than mine. And so it's one of the real challenges in talking about these technologies is that they can be applied with a really varied range of areas with very, very different effects. And so trying to get some systematic description that captures the full picture, but also gets the internal variation in how these technologies are applied can be a really challenging way to start the conversation. So yeah, I've encountered, I think, a version of that, even if it's in a different context.
All right, thank you. Liz, your thoughts on that topic?
I think that's a great question. The angle that I was looking at was focusing on the use of these tools to empower society to take responsibility during a pandemic. And so I think that's a different angle from looking at AI across the board, for example, in terms of military applications and so on. And it's not an angle that I have studied yet in terms of Taiwan, but I think it certainly bears looking at, like, to what extent has this successful record in pandemic response, does that carry over into other areas of technology in Taiwan? And what kind of lessons will be learned from this approach? I think the actors within society will be disappointed if the tools are used, their tech tools are used for closed purposes rather than to open up the society, because that's certainly the society angle of the story I was telling. But I would expect that these tools would be carried over, and certainly that's an area well worth exploring.
All right, thank you. So we got a lot of great
Add one thing to that, Dave.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really interesting dynamic here where, especially when you start looking at public-private collaboration and particularly in democracies, right, in the United States in particular, I'm thinking about, we often, I went to college in Silicon Valley, and there is this tendency to look at the potential of technology. And this, I'm not going to call it tech utopianism, because I don't think that gives people who are developing these technologies enough credit. I think a lot of them are very thoughtful, but it is really easy when you're focused on the development and application of a product for good, not to see how a changed political or social context could lead very quickly to its application for much more harmful purposes. And I think that's a conversation that's important to have, particularly since the American way of approaching surveillance technology is so heavily right now reliant on private actors and private tech companies and developers, not necessarily on the government and government control. I realize that's opening a whole can of worms about the American approach to technology and the things that have been in the news lately. I don't necessarily intend to go down that road, except to say that because these developers and companies do become global actors, mm-hmm. That I recognize fully the challenge they face and that they can't always picture the environments in which this technology will be adapted for very different political purposes. But I think it's still incumbent on them to try. And for those of us who work on those international contexts to make them aware and share the information that might not be easy for them to get, or might not be, it's not it is my full-time job. It's not their full-time job, right? That's why we have a division of labor. But I think then it makes those conversations all the more important.
Yeah, we certainly, I think, noted a number of times on the podcast that I mentioned where we talk about the developments in AI. There is a tension there where the scientists and researchers are developing these technologies, and they say they don't want it to be used for wrong, but as we often point out, right, they don't get that vote, right? Once they create this technology and capability, particularly in a digital era, that means it becomes available for everyone, and we have to deal with the ramifications of that creation, and who chooses to do well with it. And that's why we need to be part of that conversation and helping to shape it to something positive and try to minimize the negative. So we've got a lot of great questions coming in. I see a couple on the questions about the Uyghurs. We'll get to those in a second. There was one question in particular that was clarification for Liz, which is if you can basically provide any further information on the intelligent fence system. That one caught my eye certainly as well. Any validation on the accuracy of tracking people or the precision of the location, or how did phone manufacturers play into providing more precise data? Any more data or information you can provide for our folks here on that?
I can't provide information on the technical side, but I can say that this effort was a joint one involving government, phone carriers, and also the police. And so the idea was that that you would have to be checking in with a particular app, and if you fail to do so, then the police would come knocking at your door, saying, "Where are you?" and trying to track you down. So I imagine that that there would be lapses in coverage at certain times, but the effort was to avoid wholesale lockdowns like China had, so that only people who had contacts with people with COVID would be facing quarantine, or people who had COVID, not the general population. And I think this speaks to the sensitivity in Taiwan to repressive measures in view of their authoritarian past, period of white terror and so on, that people would not be receptive to this kind of approach. And so this was an effort to target particular populations. And it seemed to work well enough, accompanied by fines. So if you failed to cooperate with a quarantine, you could be charged up to $33,000. Your name could be published. So there are a lot of different levers apart from technological ones to implement this policy.
All right, thank you. So as I mentioned, we've got a couple questions related to the implementation of these technologies when it comes to certain ethnic populations and whatever. So let me start to hit on a couple of those. Here's a question. Dr. Greitens, has China's use of surveillance technology in regard to their actions taken against ethnic populations, for example, the Uyghurs, been accurately portrayed or overstated? Any thoughts on that, how it's being portrayed?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I think the reporting that I've followed has generally been excellent, right? The Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, a number of other investigative outlets, the number of documents that have that from within the Chinese political system that have become available, that talk about the way that these systems work, and their relationship then to this project of collective repression and mass extrajudicial incarceration, is really, really, I think the thrust of the reporting is pretty accurate. I think the question is, there are a few areas where I think people who focus on Xinjiang without putting it in the broader Chinese context miss a little bit of the interrelationship between, how these technologies are applied in Xinjiang and how they're applied in other parts of the country. So the use of surveillance tools, for example, that get embedded within the system called community grid management, where China divides a city up into a geographic grid, kind of like playing Battleship or something, right? There's the A column and the numbers, and everybody has a grid, and there are people who are tasked with monitoring and keeping order and providing social services and things like public services in that grid. That way of organizing and the use of surveillance in community grid management actually was pioneered on the East Coast in the kind of mid 2000s, and really ramped up nationwide over the course of the 15 years since. Xinjiang, if anything, was actually behind in that process, in part because it's a poor province, and it really kind of taken a different approach to policing and public security in that post 2009 period. But what we saw, especially around, starting around 2015, was this really intensive attempt to not only catch Xinjiang up, but kind of leapfrog it, and make it subject to much even more intensive surveillance than exists in a lot of other parts of China. But what I think is important to note is that it's actually less the surveillance technology necessarily. There are features of the surveillance ecosystem in Xinjiang that are unique, but what is unique is how that surveillance technology and the data it generates translates into state treatment of citizens. Mm-hmm. Right? There is not another place, even if you use some of the same data in an urban, environment on the Eastern Seaboard, you're not using it for this project of detaining and extrajudicially incarcerating and re-educating, upwards of 1 million minority inhabitants of a particular region. And so I think we want to differentiate a little bit between the use of surveillance and the use to which surveillance is then put. And to me, there are differences in the surveillance environment, but the biggest differences emerge in how surveillance is then used to govern. And that is where China's approach to Xinjiang is quite different. And I guess I'll add that, because I thought the comment about intelligent fence was really, really interesting, right? The use of these algorithms, and one of the questions also asked about using them to track Uyghurs elsewhere in China, which is occurring, right? There's when these tools are used elsewhere, they can be used to flag or track the movement of particular ethnicities. And as there have been public security incidents outside of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that's become increasingly embedded into China's counterterrorism and public security architecture. But the interesting thing as it relates to this question about intelligent fence is that algorithms, in some sense, have to choose, would they prefer a false positive or a false negative, right? The error rate is never zero on any of these tools. And so that choice is not inherently technological. Technology shapes that choice because it affects how big we think the margin of error is, either way, and the likelihood of a false positive or a false negative. But typically the issue that we have is that democracies are willing to accept a much lower rate of false positives. Mm-hmm. It's not clear to me that China perceives it as especially problematic to have a quote unquote false positive, because the whole idea of what a positive is because it's preventive, you're inherently targeting people who have not already engaged in politically problematic activity, even politically problematic as it's defined by the CCP. So this idea of preventive, population level immunization, right? You don't immunize people who've already been exposed to a virus usually. You immunize people before they come into contact. And so, what part of what that suggests is that this whole idea that we would try to lower the false positive rate doesn't work very well for the model that China is pursuing. And so I'm not sure that the use of AI or these use of screening tools really cares all that much. And I'll add, Taiwan used to have, there were times in Taiwan's history, particularly during the height of the White Terror, where the public security and the police authorities, martial law authorities were saying things like, well, it's better to overcorrect rather than let one guilty person go free, right? That was an ROC martial law era saying. So I think this is more generally true that authoritarian regimes just tend to be a little more willing to tolerate false positives. It's one of the sort of the tragedies of systems that work that way and that are repressive is that they inherently sometimes accept the targeting of people that we would consider innocent and that democracies would define as innocent. And one of the, I think, strengths of democracy is that intolerance for false positives and the injustice that accompanies that.
I'd just like to add one point to that. I think that's really fascinating discussion, but I think there's a difference between intelligence defense systems and ethnic profiling through facial recognition. So you can create a set of tools to track people's movements to make sure they're not violating quarantine, but I think that there's an order of magnitude of difference of what's happening in China in terms of facial profiling and ethnic facial recognition and ethnic profiling. Facial recognition is widespread, as anyone knows who's been to a Chinese airport, that you can find out where your gate is personally by standing in front of the board. So I think that they have taken these tools a step further in ways that a democracy would not tolerate.
Yeah, let me just to clarify, because maybe I wasn't clear about that. The reason that I was interested in the comment about intelligent defense was this decision about the margin of error, right, and how a democratic system handled the margin of error. But you're absolutely right that it's very important to note that not only is the approach to the margin of error different, what policy is generating a margin of error is fundamentally different in the two cases, and one is something that you could do in a democracy related to quarantine enforcement, and one is something that most democracies would not allow. So thanks, that's an important clarification, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that up front.
So we have a question here about vaccine credentials from Nicole. How is Asia evolving the use of vaccine credential comparable to what the World Health Organization is pressing for? Are they headed toward mandating all travelers have an app to enter the country, verifying type and regency of vaccination based on the sovereign nation determined trust framework? Thoughts on that from the nations that we've been discussing here?
I haven't looked specifically at the vaccine app as it relates to travel. I don't know what Taiwan's approach to that has been. So I'm gonna have to pause on that one. I'm not sure I can speak to that.
Okay, Liz, any thoughts? Is Taiwan looking at this?
Well, Taiwan is just in the process of vaccination. So I think that's the focus now. Obtaining the vaccine, 20 million doses have been ordered from Moderna, AstraZeneca, COVAX, and then Taiwan's trying to produce its own vaccine. So that's the first step. I'm not sure what's going to happen next, because I think that's going to be the challenge with countries having different degrees of vaccine receptivity. Is that China is quite low compared to many countries. And so I know there's been talk in New Zealand, Australia about creating travel bubbles for countries that have had relatively low incidence of COVID, but I'm not sure about how the broader region is going to deal with different vaccination rates within countries?
I think this is going to be a really important, geopolitical discussion and potentially worrisome fault line, because I do think it's also a question about, and it's not clear to me exactly what the WHO's role is going to end up being in this, because I think that was part of the question as well. In part because you're not just looking at countries with different vaccine receptivity rates or levels of vaccination. I mean, in the United States, we're still having a conversation about, the fact that willingness to get vaccinated, it varies a lot depending on a whole host of factors, age, health, education, income, race and ethnicity. Like this is I think the focus in the US has very much been on trying to figure out those dynamics internally. But the other question I think we're going to have to confront is about, as different countries manufacture their own vaccines, what's the agreed upon standard for efficacy of a vaccine? And there's been some contention already over that with the Chinese data, right? And the ability to actually look at that data and verify the efficacy of the vaccine and how that compares with the vaccines that are coming out of other places in the international system. So I actually think we're not there yet, but as we look ahead at the next year and a half or 2 years, I would not be surprised to see some very real contention in the international system, not only over sort of the baseline rate of vaccination of citizens in a country and how that affects individual level mobility, but also, did you get a vaccine that another country accepts as working, quote unquote, well enough? And who gets to decide what well enough is in the international system or for entry into a particular country? I think those questions are going to get very complicated.
I was going to say, is there any organization, would it be the World Health Organization that would try to wrangle that problem and be the central point for those discussions? Or, I mean, I assume at the end of the day, right, it's the willingness of the nations to have that discussion and to try to come to a consensus. But we have, I don't know.
That's not been the function of the WHO in the past.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a new challenge, and I think Sheena is correct that it's going to create a lot of tensions in terms of comparing different vaccines and are certain vaccines accepted by the authorities of other countries. So this is definitely going to be an issue to watch in the future, how that resolves.
All right. So we have two other questions here that are kind of related. So, and even though they're aimed at Liz, I think Sheena, that you'll have some interesting insight here too on it's about societal education for these tools and with regards to privacy and data collection, et cetera. So the first question is, how important is societal education in digital democracies with regard to these tools? And right, the second question was about, for example, Taiwan's electronic fence, that to some nations might seem quite intrusive and something that would get a lot of rights pushback, particularly in the US. So there's sort of a dual prong to that, but we'll start with you, Liz, but I'm also curious what if China has something like a digital education thing, or if it's something that's largely simply enforced. So Liz, your thoughts on those questions?
I think that's a great question. And as I mentioned, Taiwan has some unique starting points that facilitated the use of these tools. But also, if we look at internet access, it's a very wired place. More than 86% of the people use internet tools. So people have a level of comfort overall with these tools. And so people would use an app to find a mask and not see it as abnormal in a sense in terms of a quarantine rule. Of course, there was pushback on some of these policies, and human rights groups were concerned about the scope and so on. But I think there was a legislative basis, and there was consensus that they wanted a better response than during the SARS period, when a lot of domestic tensions over proper responses impeded proper epidemic control. And so they had that experience. So I think it'll be interesting in the United States to see what happens after the next pandemic, because there will be one, fortunately. And so will we have learned from this case best practices like many Asian countries did with SARS and with other pandemics that they've faced. So I think that Taiwan had some special starting points. It has its unique history of that make people sensitive to authoritarian controls, but also I think that because there was a partnership between society and the government and efforts by groups, especially technology collectives, to use technology for transparency and for accountability in the past, I think this created a level of comfort, at least temporarily, in this society. Whether it's replicable is another story. You know, so if you look at South Korea and Japan, I mean, there are different responses. Japan didn't use these kinds of digital tools to the same degree as Taiwan did. So within democracies, there are going to be differences. Japan being much more concerned about privacy rules than was the case in Taiwan.
All right, thank you. Sheena, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a few. I mean, I think, the point that you raised at the beginning about individuals no longer having full visibility or control over the use of their data once it's collected, even by an app that's a private sector app, right? Data can be resold, right? That process and that chain, I think, has really changed conversations about digital privacy, and I hope the US will accelerate its discussions of how we handle this. I have my own personal preference, which is to really try to put more control in the hands of individuals about where that data goes. But I think, as I think about that's sort of more of a personal me as a democratic citizen speaking with the awareness of what I've seen in other places. But I'm sort of I don't know what the right word is. I'm very old-fashioned on my use of apps and trying to keep control over my data. So that may just make me a dinosaur. More broadly, I think the interesting point here is that, I think it's likely that even different democracies are going to come to different collective judgments about their comfort with the use of these tools and data privacy in different contexts. And I actually think that's okay. What I like about the process that Taiwan and South Korea went through after SARS and MERS is actually the process. And in some ways, I think we need to be concerned about outcomes, but I would focus pretty centrally on process because that's what we can control right now and shape right now. And I would really, echo Liz's call to learn the right lessons now and try to get a framework in place so that we're not doing these 4 week at a time, we're going to quarantine, we're going to do this with masks, but the town that's on the other side of the Missouri-Kansas border is going to do the opposite thing. And so in practice, you have one city with two different sets of rules, right? I mean, there's lots of, that's a hypothetical example, but right, we've all seen that this, having to quote unquote cross the river by feeling for stones, to use the very Deng Xiaoping expression here, has been really challenging for a lot of societies and local communities, and made the process fairly contentious at times. So I mean, what I like about and what I think are the virtues of the approach that South Korea and Taiwan went through are they said, okay, we've had this experience with the pandemic. Let's figure now that it's done. Let's go back and revisit our infectious disease legislation and figure out if this happens again, based on what we know, what would we want? What data would we allow the government to collect? How would it be collected? What would be the firewalls to prevent it from being accessed for any purpose other than the emergency, right? So how do we meet this necessary and proportional standard? We only collect what we need. and we only let the people who are dealing with the public health emergency use it for that purpose. It can't go get used for like, traffic tickets or local police departments for other, there can't be sort of mission creep on the use of the data that's collected. And then, we're also going to decide when that data gets, not only we stop collecting it, but we maybe even go back and delete the data that was collected for privacy reasons and to prevent misuse of it. And, Taiwan and South Korea didn't arrive at exactly the same conclusions, but they went through a process where not under emergency conditions, right? The legislature got to debate, citizens got to weigh in, the whole thing was done relatively transparently, and there was a judicial review or an opportunity for judicial review of the legislation. Again, that's not to say that they're perfect or that the approach that either place adopted is exactly the one I'd recommend in a country like the United States. It probably isn't. But I think, that process is at the heart of democracy, right? And so, I guess the lessons that I would want to learn and the thing that I would really want all of us to take away from it is, okay, that process needs to start now, right? Or later this summer as we get back to normal life and things are able to resume, right? Let's talk about that now with the pressure off so that we're not trying to do a democratic process where people feel like there's a metaphorical gun to their head, right? That sort of eviscerates the consent and the transparency and the deliberation that are at the heart of democratic decision making. And so I would really want us to figure out how to protect that and come up with a plan now before the next big public health issue.
All right. So let's see. We do have a question from Jen here, which I promise we're going to get to, but I think it's a good one probably to end on. So first, I'm going to throw out a question here from John Healy, who asks, basically on the topic of the idea that China's surveillance systems are proliferating across the region. Is the US government addressing this at all as a national security priority? And if not, well, maybe what are some ways to be thinking about that or what that might look like? Any thoughts on that question from either of you?
Yeah, just really, really quickly. I don't think there's been enough urgency paid to that. One of the things we've seen is that places that adopt Chinese technology don't tend to de-adopt it fully, right? The UK and Huawei is a little bit of an outlier in that sense. So what I would like to see is, a coordinated interagency process, probably led by the NSC, because I don't really see another good place to do it, to quarterback the process. I wrote a paper for a project at the University of Pennsylvania that outlines kind of 7 recommendations on this that I'm happy to share with anybody as a follow-up. But one of the really important pieces of that is that for these sort of middle or weak democracies, that's where a lot of the focus should be, because a lot of the abuses of this technology are occurring in autocratic states that are already autocratic. We can try to limit the damage, but our ability to impact, how that technology is used in those systems is more limited. But there are a lot of places in weak democracies where the risk of pandemic-related backsliding specific to the pandemic is pretty high. I would probably strategically concentrate on those countries, and I would figure out what are the, maybe they adopted this technology, maybe you can't take it out right away. So what are the both technical and legal safeguards that could be put in order to protect democracy and prevent democratic erosion in the meantime? So I think rather than focusing solely on a push for de-adoption, we need kind of a 2-level strategy, which is it'd really be better if you don't adopt this technology at all, or you take it out if you started to put it in. But if that's not an option, here are the firewalls you can put in so that at least it doesn't damage democracy. And I think that second layer is going to end up being really important. And that's the piece I don't think has gotten enough urgency or attention yet. I hope it will.
Great. Liz, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to add something on the global dimension of this. It's going to be interesting as the summer comes and we all get somewhat back to normal, what countries are going to present as the takeaway from their own response. And I think China has been very active in trying to reshape the narrative about its own pandemic response. And I think the use of these surveillance technologies is going to be a component of this takeaway that China is going to be putting forward. And so I think that other countries, democratic ones in Asia, also need to do this in terms of providing alternative models for using technology. And maybe there can be some, I don't know, industry-wide effort through NGOs or something to promote different experiences of democracies in using technology. Evan Feigenbaum had an interesting article about technological innovation in Taiwan and how Taiwan can participate in various non-governmental fora about technology. And so that this might be an appropriate venue for various public-private efforts that have been used in Asia to be showcased so that China doesn't get the last word on technology use, because as it's trying to do with its Health Silk Road diplomacy. So perhaps in Asia-wide organizations, this or an APEC or an ASEAN, I mean, these kinds of discussions can be put forward so that there are different options that countries can select. Because China has the market power in terms of delivering these systems, as Sheena said, but those aren't the only ones or the only ways. And I think that needs to be clearer.
All right, thank you very much. All right, I've saved the best question for last, or the best questions for last. And don't worry, I'm gonna try to tackle this one first, if you don't mind. So here's the question. From Jen Gableline, what are your thoughts on artificial general intelligence coming into play as opposed to traditional AI in terms of surveillance? With a follow-on question of, what is and should be the United States' role in shaping international norms and approaches to artificial intelligence, particularly as it pertains to risks associated with artificial general intelligence? So if I can take a crack at this one first, what I'll kind of say is, the discussion I've largely seen in this sphere is, right, you get a smattering of opinions as to when we're going to see artificial general intelligence. By that definition, meaning when you have an AI that is capable of basically human cognition level ability to address multiple topics and issues in many environments, et cetera. You get very mixed opinions, right? There will be the people that say we're imminent and it's going to be here shortly. Maybe the bell curve hump happens a few decades out from where we are currently, and then it sort of trails off with time into never. And so, first of all, I'll just kind of say, I think that, you know, if you follow the bell, again, the shape of that curve, that's likely to be something that we're not going to have to worry, maybe even in our own lifetimes. However, what I will note to your follow-on question about the United States' role, what I've also noticed is that apparently the conversation is currently being driven more in the academic and, for lack of a better word, philanthropist spheres. So you have people like Max Tegmark, who have established institutions, and I forget the name of his particular one, but it's like the Future of Humanity. You have individuals creating organizations like this to have that discussion and to talk about how we're going to shape the future of humanity as something like AGI comes online or potentially enters into our capabilities. But you'll note, right? I mean, it's largely not being driven by governments. It seems to be more driven by these other organizations and individuals. So at the moment, my observation is that the US is not involved in those discussions, at least from a government perspective. So I think right now, it's very much a close-end problem, right? Everyone is very focused on artificial narrow intelligence and dealing with how to integrate and consider these simpler capabilities such as facial recognition and other narrow capabilities of AI. So it's a great question. I do not see it personally on the radar scope of the US government at the moment. So any thoughts from Liz or Sheena on that one?
I think, you know, my focus has been even a little bit prior to the use of AI, right, which is these more basic tools of surveillance technology. And I've been very persuaded by the writing by folks like David Kay, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on some of this, who talks about the fact that this is just domestically pretty unregulated and internationally very unregulated. And what we've seen, and the paper for the Penn Project that I mentioned a moment ago talks a little bit about this, is that China has been much more strategic in its approach to pulling domestic actors together, both state and private or semi-private, that whole hybrid space that China has in tech. And saying, okay, what do we want global standards to be? And then going out and actually proposing them in organizations like the ITU. And so we see that a lot of the standards that have already been adopted on facial recognition and other types of surveillance technologies are those that originated in China, right? The proposal originated from the Chinese side. And for reasons that I don't quite understand, the United States has not been proactive in this game. And I think that needs to change fast. Because now the United States and like-minded democracies are playing catch up. Mm-hmm. And that's not where I would want us to be, but it is where we are. So I think this is, one of the recommendations in that paper is that the United States needs to very quickly get a plan in place. And that plan needs to include how we approach standard setting. I think eventually that'll get to AI, but I'm actually concerned that we don't even have our act together on a more basic set of surveillance technology tools. That might or might not be involved in the use of AI. So I would wholeheartedly endorse the US government has not been as engaged on this as I think it probably should be, but at an even more basic level than the one that Dave just highlighted.
I'll just add that that if you look at the information space in general, I think authoritarian states have been much more active in trying to define the rules, like China and Russia and some other countries teaming up on information sovereignty and so on. And I think the difference is that there the governments do set the standards, but in democracies, the impetus comes from companies, the private sector and the nonprofit sector. And so government is not so involved necessarily. But I agree with Sheena completely that we risk ceding this space with these new technologies if the government does not get involved. And there should be dialogue, government dialogue, private sector, government, private sector, nonprofit dialogues about how the best way to do this in a democracy would be. Because we don't want authoritarian states creating the rules of the road for these kinds of digital technology.
Yeah, I guess I would just add one thing to that, which is that we also probably don't want the tech companies necessarily writing the rules themselves, right? That's not effective, regulation, and the regulatory state exists for very specific purposes that are sometimes very important. And so, that dialogue needs to be a two-way street, right? So there needs to be input from tech companies in the private sector, but the United States also, I think, the government needs to figure out how to, understand and reflect citizen preferences also outside of the, sort of specific interests of the technology companies. That's really important, but that sort of more diffuse general citizen interest is also really important for democracies to get right. And again, now we're doing it under time pressure, and democracy isn't always good at policymaking under time constraints. So I hope that's something that the administration will address more urgently going forward.
All right, well, we're nearing the end of our time here, so this is probably a good point to wrap up. Any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with? And we've had a great discussion, some really fascinating topics and insight into what's been happening here during the pandemic. Anything to add before I close up?
I'd just say one thing that's been fascinating about studying this topic is that it's the first pandemic of the high-tech era. Because if you compare it to SARS, if we were talking in the SARS era, we would be having a totally different conversation about China mobilizing workers to build hospitals and block roads and so on. And so I think that the evolution in technology has really changed the way we think about pandemic response.
Mm.
And so I think it bears looking back historically to make some comparisons in terms of effectiveness and what it means about success in terms of various states in combating this pandemic.
I don't think I have anything to add. This is fast moving. The stakes feel very high, and so it's great to be part of a conversation that's this well informed and this thoughtful on this stuff. So thanks.
All right. Well, that reminds me, right? We just had the 10-year anniversary of the earthquake in Japan with the tsunami that happened. And we actually just had the 11th anniversary of the earthquake in Haiti. And what kind of reminds me is just those were two particular events that happened on the cusp of just the communication, social media and everything that was just really coming into its forefront. And it was one of the first couple instances where we saw how social media played into a crisis at the time. And so in a way, we're seeing similar things here, as Liz mentioned, right? The way the world has evolved and these technologies and how it's factoring into how we're going to deal with global crises like this. So it's going to be interesting to watch this as we continue to move forward. And it'll be great to continue to have these discussions. So thank you again. Thank you to all who are calling in to participate in today's seminar. We really appreciate your time here and your questions and your discussion. For those of you who know CNA, thank you for joining us again in this conversation. And for our new guests, we hope that this is the first of many times that we'll have the opportunity to engage with you and that we can keep this dialogue that we started today here going. So thank you again. And until next time, out here.